The chapel stood where the road thinned into rutted earth and the vineyards gave way to stone, a modest structure raised by the House of Bellori in the last years of the 14th century, when wealth still sought discretion. It had walls of pale limestone and a roof that trapped winter cold, and it had never been consecrated in the proper sense. No bishop's seal marked its threshold. No saint's name was etched above the door. It existed as an accommodation rather than a proclamation, a place where the family could kneel without inviting attention, and where the village below could believe, comfortably, that nothing of consequence occurred. The disturbance came during repair, not revelation. A mason's chisel struck hollow beneath the altar stone, producing a sound too clean to ignore. The slab was lifted with irritation rather than reverence, revealing a cavity sealed with older mortar, darker and oily, as though mixed by hand rather than recipe. Inside, there was no reliquary, no bone wrapped in silk, no icon wrapped in legend. There was only soot layered thick as velvet, the residue of countless candles burned in proximity to something that had never been named. The walls bore shallow scratches, repeated in careful rows, marks made by a tool that returned to the same angle again and again. Set into the floor lay a thin tablet of wax, impressed with characters that bent toward Latin, but refused its grammar, a prayer structured like a command yet addressed to nothing recognizable. The absence was immediate and unsettling. Local priests were summoned and left quietly. No denunciation followed. No sermon warned the faithful. The Bellori were old enough to be tolerated, generous enough to be excused. Aristocratic eccentricity. It was said, a family indulging in inherited superstition best left unexamined. The altar stone was replaced. The cavity was resealed. And yet the bells began to ring. They rang at hours when no hand pulled rope and no wind moved air. A single dull note that carried downhill and died before it could echo. Villagers crossed themselves and learned to listen without looking up. The sound never coincided with mass. It followed the sky instead. Eclipses, partial and full, drew out with a consistency that survived seasons and repairs. The bell rope was inspected, replaced, removed entirely. The ringing persisted, as though the chapel itself were breathing in response to a darkness overhead. Within the Bellori estate, records continued to be kept with meticulous calm. Household expense ledgers, bound in casket and annotated by successive stewards, listed annual gatherings with precision denied to births and deaths. Candles purchased in quantities that exceeded liturgical need. Linen cleaned and stored without names attached. Meals prepared in silence. Ingredients noted, but guests left uncounted. These entries clustered around astronomical events, marked not with dates of saints, but with symbols scratched into margins. Curved strokes that mirrored those found beneath the altar. One document survives intact where others fray at the edges. A wax tablet, recovered generations later from an archive misfiled among tax receipts, bears a short notation impressed with care. Attendance by the unseen. No flourish follows. No justification. The phrase stands alone, as if explanation would have been redundant. The wax itself is worn thin at the center, as though pressed repeatedly by a finger that returned to the same point. Word of the chapel's peculiarities travels slowly, carried by servants who left service without complaint and by traders who declined invitations with vague excuses. Authority remained distant. The church, when pressed, found no doctrine to oppose a worship that claimed no God. Without name or icon, there was no heresy to condemn. Without confession, there was nothing to absolve. Silence became policy, and policy became permission. Time thickened around the structure. Candles suffused the stone during one winter of excessive burning, leaving the bell cracked and partially melted, its metal sagging like wax left too near flame. The bell was removed and replaced with a simpler casting, which rang once and then split along a seam that predated its installation. The broken metal was stored beneath the chapel, where it cooled into an unrecognizable shape, fused to the floor as if reluctant to leave. When the Bellori line thinned, as all lines do, the chapel remained. Its door was kept locked. Its interior was spared alteration. The cavity beneath the altar was not reopened, yet the floor above it grew warm on nights when the sky darkened in precise ways. Account from the period describe a weight in the air, a pressure that made breath deliberate and sound reluctant. No figure was ever reported, no voice recorded, only the sense of presence, acknowledged and accommodated. The pattern might have ended there, contained by geography and discretion, had it not been for a clerical ledger discovered decades later in a Bohemian archive, its margins marked with the same curved strokes. The notation was identical in form, if not in language. Attendance. Unseen. The ink was fresh enough to bleed when pressed. The Bellori Chapel, it appeared, had not been alone. The great hall of the House of Kresnik had once been designed to reassure. Its beams were carved with saints in shallow relief, its walls crowded with panels depicting familiar trials and victories, its long table aligned so that the family patriarch sat beneath a painted Christ whose gaze enforced order. By the middle of the 15th century, all of this had been removed. Not smashed, not burned, but taken down carefully, cataloged, and stored in crates that were never reopened. What replaced them was absence arranged with intent. Bare plaster walls, unadorned stone, and at the center of the floor where rugs had once softened sound, a circle burned dark into the flagstones as if heat had been applied slowly and repeatedly until the stone itself learned the shape. This rededication occurred quietly, justified outwardly as renovation during a time when Bohemia fractured along religious lines. Icons were dangerous. Allegiances shifted with sermons. To empty a hall was to declare neutrality, and neutrality carried value. The Kresniks hosted fewer feasts after the change, but those they did host followed a pattern that unsettled servants without giving them language for complaint. Guests were invited and dismissed at precise hours. Meals were served and cleared untouched. The table was set fully, yet one chair at its head was never occupied, never moved, never acknowledged. Witness accounts preserved in later depositions described gatherings conducted without invocation. No prayer opened the evening. No blessing closed it. The family and their guests stood within the blackened circle and breathed together, slowly, in counted rhythm. Silence was enforced not by threat, but by expectation, as though sound itself were inappropriate. Those who broke it once did not repeat the error. They reported a sensation of pressure behind the eyes, a physical reminder that the room was already full. The anomaly lay not in what was done, but in what was consistently omitted. There was no God named, no spirit summoned, no text recited. The rites resisted classification because they resisted declaration. Parish priests, already navigating doctrinal chaos, noted the changes and chose restraint. The Kresniks still paid tithes. They still attended public services when required. Their private hall, stripped of God, was deemed a domestic matter. It did not remain private for long. Parish record from surrounding villages began to show gaps that aligned too neatly to ignore. Feast days passed without attendance. Confessions dropped without explanation. These absences corresponded with nights when the Kresnik estate glowed faintly at its windows, light held low and steady, never flickering. Correspondence between family members, written in a measured hand, refers to successful nights in full rooms, language borrowed from hospitality but unaccompanied by guest lists. One letter notes satisfaction that no breath was wasted, a phrase repeated often enough to become formula. Authority approached obliquely. An imperial clerk was dispatched to inventory the estate's holdings during a period of taxation reform. His report survives, though portions have been cut away. What remains mentions disorientation upon entering the Great Hall, a sensation of standing on a slope where none existed. He describes a circle in the floor as inducing vertigo, as if the stone beneath were subtly concave. Measurements taken on subsequent visits contradict his notes, listing the floor as level and sound. The discrepancy was not resolved. The clerk did not return. The evidence that finally prompted intervention took the form of a folio confiscated during a broader sweep of prohibited texts. Its pages were filled with marginal symbols that resembled neither runes nor ecclesiastical shorthand. They curved inward, repeating at varying scales, suggesting motion without direction. Interspersed among them were practical notes, times, durations, atmospheric conditions. No names appeared, no instructions, only confirmations. The folio was sealed and archived, its origin attributed to Bellori materials previously gathered and forgotten, a connection made quietly and without explanation. After the Kresnik line fractured through marriage and debt, the Great Hall passed to less patient occupants. They attempted restoration. Saints were rehung. Rugs returned. The blackened circle resisted removal, darkening again beneath new stone. Those who slept in the hall reported being watched from below, not by eyes but by attention, a pressure that gathered at the center and expanded outward. Renovations ceased. The hall was locked and left to echo. Imperial authorities, now aware of a pattern, began to cross-reference their sealed holdings. Symbols repeated, phrases aligned. The absence had a shape, and it was no longer confined to a single house or country. The record suggests a realization forming slowly, reluctantly, that what had been tolerated as eccentricity had learned to persist without patrons, and that somewhere beyond Bohemia, another household was setting a place at an empty table. By the time attention turned toward the House of Calderon, the machinery of authority had already learned caution. Early 16th century Spain did not lack mechanisms for identifying deviation. Heresy had vocabulary. Blasphemy had form. Sorcery, at least, had accusation. What arrived at the doors of the Inquisition, instead, was a stack of denunciations remarkable for what they failed to say. Servants were disappearing, not fleeing, not dying, simply removed from household rosters between one accounting and the next. No crime was alleged, no doctrine cited. The papers asked only that someone look. The inspection was ordered as a matter of hygiene, not alarm. Calderon lands were productive, their taxes current, their public observance impeccable. The inspectors arrived expecting to record excess, perhaps cruelty disguised as piety. What they encountered was absence organized to the point of discomfort. The household was smaller than expected, quieter than appropriate. Rooms were prepared for use and then left untouched, as if awaiting a schedule that no longer required human presence. At the center of the main dining chamber stood a long table laid with precision, candles trimmed to identical height, plates warmed and empty. At the head, a single chair faced the room. It bore no crest. It was never offered. Interrogation transcripts preserved from the visit described witnesses struggling to maintain coherence. Servants spoke of dinners where no one ate, of instructions to clear plates that had never been used yet felt heavy when lifted, as though weight had been transferred without residue. They described rites conducted without words, gestures limited to alignment and stillness. When asked if the family worshipped, responses collapsed into silence, not refusal, inability. The questions themselves seemed to fail. Rumors escaped the estate faster than reports. Nobles, it was said, were hosting banquets for something that never consumed, never spoke, never left its seat. The phrase spread because it could not be corrected. Fear replaced curiosity. Attendance at Calderon gatherings declined until invitations ceased altogether. The family did not protest. Their correspondence in the period indicates satisfaction with reduced interference, noting that the table remains complete. The anomaly deepened within the records themselves. Charges drafted by inquisitors appear in multiple hands, listing familiar offenses before being struck through and replaced with blank space. Entire pages are preserved where headings remain, but content has been scraped away, as if the act of naming had been attempted and abandoned. One margin note, surviving only because the ink bled too deeply to erase, read simply, no term applies. The Inquisition escalated carefully. Surveillance was increased. Additional servants were questioned. None reported violence. None described threat. Instead, a pattern emerged of gradual withdrawal. Those who left Calderon's service spoke of an increasing difficulty in distinguishing between occupied and unoccupied rooms, of hearing chairs shift when no one entered, of feeling compelled to set places even when instructed not to. One deposition notes that the empty chair was dusted daily, not by order but by habit, the cloth returning warmer than expected. The evidence that should have forced resolution arrived in fragments. A dossier assembled over several months includes floor plans annotated with arrows that converge on the same point, regardless of room orientation. Candle inventories show consumption without corresponding residue. A ledger records a payment for linen repair attributed to pressure damage, not wear. The margins of the dossier are charred, as if exposed to heat after compilation. The burn marks stop short of the text, precise enough to suggest intention. Then the interrogation ceased mid-session. One chamber was found abandoned with candles still burning, chairs overturned as if vacated in haste. No struggle was recorded, no bodies discovered. The room itself appeared unwilling to remain disturbed. Furniture found righted upon return. The dossier ends there. A sealed order follows, transferring jurisdiction from ecclesiastical to secular authority without explanation. It is the first recorded instance of the church stepping aside not from danger, but from incomprehensibility. What followed is documented only obliquely. Calderon lands remained in family hands for a time, then passed through intermediaries whose records are incomplete. Servant disappearances slowed and then stopped, not because the pattern ended, but because there were fewer witnesses left to notice. The empty chair remained listed in inventories, categorized as essential furniture. When later officials attempted removal, it resisted classification, its weight fluctuating between measurements. The haunting residue of the case is not a ghost story, but a room preserved in contradiction, an interrogation chamber that refuses to stay disturbed, a dossier that cannot hold language. Authority confronted with phenomenon that offered no crime to punish and no God to denounce. In the margins of the final report, a different hand has added a note directing attention northward, to an estate in France where ownership has lapsed but ritual has not. The implication is clear enough to require no elaboration. The Chateau de Valcroix sat above the river like an afterthought that had outlived its purpose, a 17th century estate built not for defense but for continuity. Its facade was symmetrical, its gardens disciplined, its interior arranged around a central salon whose proportions enforced balance. For generations, the Valcroix family maintained a reputation for restraint. Their wealth was old, their influence quiet, their correspondence polite to the point of emptiness. When the last heirs died within a single decade, one from fever, one from a riding fall, one from a sudden failure of breath, there was no scandal to explain it and no rival eager to claim the land. What unsettled the region was not the extinction of the line, but the refusal of the estate to acknowledge it. Servants remained. Schedules held. Candles were lit at the same hours they had always been lit. The great salon was prepared nightly with the same precision recorded in inventories that predated the deaths. No one issued these orders. They were followed because they had always been followed, and because deviation produced discomfort that no one could articulate. The trigger that drew attention came when a neighboring village reported synchronized disturbances. Livestock refused to enter certain fields. Children woke at the same hour across households, describing dreams of rooms rearranging themselves around a center that could not be approached. The chateau, now officially ownerless, continued to glow faintly at night, its windows emitting a steady inward-facing light. Local authorities visited and found nothing actionable. The staff were compliant. The books were immaculate. The rooms were clean. The anomaly revealed itself gradually. Royal surveyors dispatched to assess the estate for reassignment returned with floor plans that could not be reconciled. Measurements taken on consecutive days disagreed. Doors aligned differently without signs of alteration. The central salon, when sketched, always resolved into the same geometry. Furniture oriented toward an empty focal point, regardless of how it had been placed the night before. Attempts to mark the floor with chalk resulted in smudges that migrated overnight, gathering toward the center and fading by morning. Social reactions shifted from curiosity to exploitation. The chateau gained reputation as cursed but profitable. Visitors paid for access. Guides invented stories to satisfy demand. Those who stayed the night reported nausea, pressure in the chest, a sensation of being counted. None described an apparition. The absence was consistent. It did not announce itself. It organized. Escalation followed through documentation rather than disaster. A notarized inventory compiled during a transfer attempt includes an entry that has since been cited in multiple archives. Presence acknowledged, owner absent. The phrasing is deliberate, recorded without commentary. Other entries list chairs, linens, candles, all in quantities that implied use without users. Repairs were noted where stone showed compression without impact. A stair rail was replaced after bending inward, as if leaned upon repeatedly by something that did not climb. The staff began to thin. Some left with severance paid from accounts that continued to replenish without income. Others stayed and ceased to age in expected ways, their appearance described in later depositions as fixed, neither young nor old. Nightmares spread beyond this state. Villages downstream reported the river slowing at specific hours, its surface dimpling around invisible obstructions. Fish avoided stretches of water, aligned with the chateau's central axis. Royal intervention arrived late and cautiously. Orders were issued to seal the salon and redistribute the staff. The seals were found intact each morning, the doors behind them unlocked. Furniture removed from the room was discovered returned, positioned with care. When the salon was finally walled off, the walls developed hairline fractures that traced the same inward curving symbols found in earlier cases. Faint but unmistakable. The lasting mark of Valcroy is architectural rather than narrative. The chateau's floor plan, preserved in multiple state archives, cannot be overlaid without distortion. Each version insists on a center that is not there. Surveyors eventually ceased attempts at correction. The estate was left to stand, its grounds slowly reclaimed, its windows dark at last. Yet reports persisted of pressure in the air when passing the gates, of voices lowering without instruction. Correspondence from this period reveals a broader awareness taking shape. Officials noted similar spatial anomalies beyond France, logged under different names, dismissed as measurement error. When compared, the errors aligned. The implication was no longer coincidence. Whatever had been accommodated by families and tolerated by institutions now demonstrated the capacity to persist without either. And somewhere farther east, records indicate a household that chose not to close the door at all. The house of a Devane prided itself on clarity. By the late 18th century, their estate stood as a model of rational order, its libraries arranged by subject rather than tradition, its laboratories ventilated and lit according to the newest principles. The family correspondence from this period is confident in tone, dismissive of superstition, precise in its language. Where other noble houses concealed habits behind silence, the Edevanes documented everything. They believed documentation was insulation. If a thing could be recorded, it could be contained. The trigger arrived as a declaration rather than a discovery. Seeking to disprove lingering rumors attached to their name, the family resolved to preserve their private rights by mechanical means. Wax cylinders were prepared, diagrams annotated, environmental conditions logged with care. The intention was simple, to demonstrate that what had long been whispered could be reduced to procedure without remainder, that the old devotions, stripped of myth, would reveal nothing beyond habit and acoustics. The rites themselves were unchanged. That was the first error. They took place in a room whose dimensions had been adjusted over decades to accommodate an empty center. The floor was reinforced. The walls thickened. Instruments were placed at measured distances and aligned to cardinal points. No prayers were spoken. No name was invoked. The family and their associates stood and breathed together, as records indicate they always had, allowing the room to fill in the way it always had. The anomaly presented itself immediately, though not in the manner expected. The cylinders captured sound where no sound should exist, and absence where resonance was required. Pressure gauges recorded synchronized fluctuations that did not correspond to movement or heat. Candles bent their flames inward without draft. Chalk dust scattered at the center lifted and settled repeatedly, as if responding to a pulse. The instruments did not fail. They behaved consistently, and in doing so documented a presence that refused depiction. Social reaction was swift and uncontainable. Scholars invited to review the materials could not agree on terminology. Clergy rejected the recordings not as heretical but as structurally unsound, claiming they violated assumptions about space and cause. Officials demanded repetition under supervision, which the Edevanes granted. The results intensified. Structural stress propagated through the estate during subsequent sessions, beams groaning in rhythm with measured pressure changes. The absence at the center acquired weight. Floors bowed toward it. Sound thinned around it. Escalation followed the logic of evidence. Additional recordings were made. Cylinders stacked and labeled. One bears a simple notation pressed to deeply into the wax. Attendance confirmed. No flourish. No signature. During playback, Listeners reported disorientation and a compulsion to adjust their posture toward the source, as though the room were reassembling itself around an invisible anchor. Several refused to remain present for the duration. One cylinder cracked during playback without apparent cause. Its fragments warmed the touch. Authority attempted intervention with unprecedented coordination. Clergy, scholars, and magistrates arrived together, united by uncertainty. The estate was placed under observation. Movement was restricted. The rites were ordered to cease. They did not because the family defied instruction, but because cessation proved indistinguishable from compliance. The room continued to respond at the appointed hours. Instruments activated themselves. Chalk marks reappeared. The center asserted its schedule. Within a generation, the house of a divane ceased to appear in censuses. Not dissolved. Removed. Maps revised themselves without record of amendment. Property registers listed the estate as extant but unassignable. Those who attempted entry reported compasses spinning and notes contradicting themselves between lines. The grounds remained, an empty plot that resisted description. Grass grew unevenly. Sound dampened without explanation. The instruments, when recovered, functioned perfectly elsewhere. The evidence prop that survives is damaged and incomplete. A wax cylinder preserved in provincial archive, misfiled among meteorological observations. Its label is intact. Attendance confirmed. The recording itself is nearly silent. Yet listeners report a sensation compression in the chest, a narrowing of breath that resolves only when the playback ends. Scholars argue over whether the cylinder records anything at all. None can deny its effect. The haunting residue of the Devane case is not a ruin, but a contradiction, an estate that exists without location. Records that align across centuries despite deliberate erasure. A symbol repeated with such fidelity that its origin becomes irrelevant. When the surviving materials from Bellori, Kresnik, Calderon, Valkroy, and Edivane are overlaid, the same curves emerge, scaled and rotated but unmistakable. 5 doors. 1 threshold. The worship did not conclude. It redistributed. The archive does not close. It thins. What remains after the last house is not a conclusion but a condition, recorded in fragments that refuse assembly yet echo one another with mechanical fidelity. Marginal notes appear in ledgers that should never have crossed borders. Floor plans drafted by different hands insist on the same empty center. Instruments designed for weather or weight or sound return readings align only when compared across centuries. The pattern persists not because it is maintained, but because it no longer requires maintenance. Later custodians attempted classification. They fail by design. The phenomenon does not announce itself as belief, does not request offense or devotion. It accommodates. It accepts space prepared without argument and time offered without name. When confronted, it yields nothing that can be seized. When ignored, it continues. The last references to the 5 houses appear not as warnings, but as corrections. A tax roll amended to remove a family that had already vanished. A parish register adjusted to reconcile absences that no longer required explanation. A map redrawn to smooth an inconsistency no one wished to measure again. Each correction narrows the field of inquiry until only repetition remains. The most recent note, dated without calendar, appears in the hand of an archivist whose other work is unremarkable. It is written beside a symbol copied too carefully to be accidental. The wording is restrained. No speculation, no alarm, only a statement procedure. The door is no longer attached to a house. What was once private right became tolerated anomaly, then institutional denial, then quiet withdrawal. Now it manifests as infrastructure, rooms arranged without builders, schedules kept without servants, attendance confirmed without witness. The absence learned to persist in systems designed to exclude it, and in doing so revealed the limits of exclusion itself. There is no instruction attached to the record, no warning appended for future readers. The materials were preserved because they resisted disposal, because attempts to seal them produced duplication elsewhere. They remain because removal has proven less effective than accommodation. If this account reaches a listener intact, it does so as residue rather than message, an impression left by alignment rather than belief. The archive does not ask to be trusted. It demonstrates what happens when a threshold is left unnamed long enough to forget that it was ever closed.